Hello everybody, Sam Butchart here. This lecture is on normative claims and arguments. So by a normative claim, I just mean a claim about what an individual or an organisation or a group should or should not do. So it might be a claim about what decision an individual should make, or about what an organisation should or shouldn't do, or about the kind of policies that a government or organisation should implement to achieve certain goals. Lots and lots of different kinds of examples. They all have this in common. They're all claims about what should or shouldn't be done. Of course, a normative claim might not use the word should. As you'll see here, there are lots of different ways in which normative claims can be expressed. And we'll look at some examples now. Those occur in lots of different contexts. For example, when you're making individual choices. Should I go to the lecture this morning, or should I stay at home and do something else? If you come to the conclusion that you should stay at home and do something else, then that's an example of a normative claim. Some are kind of, look at the difference between this one and this one. This one is kind of conditional, right? It says if you want to achieve something, then you should do something to achieve that. If you want to get good at the guitar, you should practice every day. Whereas this one is unconditional. It just says we should start saving money to buy a house now. Health is a good source of normative claims about what you should or shouldn't do, what you should or shouldn't eat, for example. Everyone wants to tell you what you should or shouldn't eat, what you should and shouldn't do. Has everyone seen a claim like this before? Everyone should drink the equivalent of 9 glasses of water a day. Is that true? Has anyone heard that before, that claim? It's a fairly common little factoid that floats around, a bit like the human beings use only 10% of their brain. And it seems kind of not implausible, right? But is it true? Well, maybe go and find out if you're interested. Organisational decisions, I mentioned. An organisation might be a university, it might be a company, it might be a government, it might be a nation. When it comes to governments, of course, what's typically being argued for are new laws. We should... all cigarette advertising should be banned. The council should not approve any more residential building applications in our suburb. The proposal to raise petrol taxes to support public transport is unfair. That one's a bit different, right? It doesn't have the word should or shouldn't do it in it. It's what I called a while ago a value claim because of the unfair, right? It's saying that the proposal is bad in a particular way. That would typically be used as part of an argument for why, for the normative claim, that we shouldn't implement this proposal. And of course, we have the domain of ethics and morality. Some quite specific kind of moral or ethical claims. I'll just use those two words to mean the same thing, by the way. Ethics and morality, I don't make any distinction between them. Just because you've got two words for a thing doesn't necessarily mean there's two different things. Right? If you borrow money from a friend, you should pay it back as soon as you can. Fairly uncontroversial normative claim, but an ethical claim, right? A moral claim. Look, the last two contradict each other.
social welfare programs paid for by taxation, for example Medicare, are an illegitimate restriction on individual freedom. Not many people in Australia believe that, some do though. It's a view that's pretty commonly held in the United States. Whereas here and in Europe and the UK, people tend to accept this contradictory claim. It's a responsibility of government to provide education and healthcare to all its citizens. That's one of the things governments are for. Many people in this country tend to think. Again, notice that doesn't say the government should do something, but it clearly implies that. If it's a responsibility, then it's something you should do. So those are just lots and lots of examples of the kind of claim that I'm talking about. The contrast is between descriptive claims and normative claims. So a descriptive claim is just a claim about the way things are. Whereas a normative claim is one about not how they are, but how they should be, how they ought to be. So they don't describe the world, they say how the world should be. Usually, the world isn't the way the person making the normative claim would like it to be, right? And that's the point of making the normative claim. So here's some examples. Here's a descriptive claim. Raju weighs 200 pounds or 91 kilograms. That's just a description of the way things are with Raju, right? Here's a normative claim. Raju needs to lose weight. Descriptive claim, factual claim, cigarettes cause cancer and many other health problems. Normative claim about what the government should do. The government should ban cigarette advertising. So descriptive versus normative. The distinction isn't always clear-cut, but it usually is. It's usually clear whether someone's merely describing the way things are or saying something about the way things ought to be. Although there's a kind of use of language called emotionally charged language, or using loaded terms, which tries to disguise a normative claim as a purely descriptive one. Maybe we'll see some examples of that later. Okay, so that's our topic. That's what a normative claim is. We're going to be talking about arguments for and against normative claims, because you can argue for them and against them. Whenever you give some reasons for a proposed course of action, then you're giving an argument for a normative claim. Like in these examples, the proposal to raise petrol taxes to support public transport is unfair, so that's our conclusion, and it's a normative claim, right? Because, here's why. Because drivers who will never use the train or bus should not be forced to pay for them. So, final conclusion, the proposal should be rejected. And that's explicitly a normative claim. We should reject this proposal. So if you were drawing a map of this argument, this would be the main conclusion. Proposal should be rejected. This sentence here is the intermediate premise that's backed up by that. So it's a chain of arguments. Because, first premise, drivers who never use train or bus should not be forced to pay for them. Therefore, the proposal is unfair. Therefore, it should be rejected. Well, how about this one? Smoke detectors are cheap and can save your life if there's a fire. So, every house should have one. These are all arguments for normative claims. Interest rates now should be reduced. Should be reduced. Okay, it's a normative claim. Why? Because blah, blah, blah. I start to go blank when economists start talking. Here's a moral argument. By donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter and medical care. If you give money to aid agencies, you can do a little bit of good. You can save some lives. Therefore, everyone who can afford to do so should donate part of their income to aid agencies. So that's a fairly strong moral claim about what everyone is morally obliged to do. This example is taken from a book by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, a book called The Life You Can Save, which is basically an extended argument for this conclusion. We might come back to it again as an example. So those are all arguments for normative claims. How do you evaluate an argument for a normative claim? Well, the same way you evaluate any argument. There are two questions. Are the premises actually true? It sometimes sounds a bit odd to call a normative or value claim true, but never mind about that. Sometimes I'll just say accept. Should we accept the premise? But I really mean accept as true. And the second question is, okay, well, supposing they are true, do they provide a sufficient reason to accept the conclusion? Do they support the conclusion? That's a different question. The most common mistake on both the first assignment and the second assignment was mixing these two things up. So, for example, has anyone here not done the second assignment? Just put your hand up if you haven't done it yet. All right, I'll trust you because I'm going to tell you the answer now if you haven't done it to one of the questions. So one of the questions on the second assignment was about the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? It's either due to a meteorite impact or volcanic eruptions. But it wasn't due to a meteorite impact, we can rule that out. So it must be volcanic eruptions that caused the death of the dinosaur. Now, some people correctly pointed out that, well, maybe those aren't the only two possibilities. But that just means the first premise would be false, right? Because the first premise says it's either this or this. Well, if there are other possibilities, that would make the first premise false. But that's got nothing to do with support, right? Got nothing to do with validity, because validity asks the question, if it was true, would the conclusion follow? And in that case it would, right? Because if those were the only two options, and we can rule one out, then the other one must be the case. So on this question of support, when you have a normative conclusion, so you're trying to argue for a claim about what you should or shouldn't do, there must be a normative claim or a value claim in the premises. Because you can't get a claim about what you should or shouldn't do just from purely descriptive claims, just from purely factual claims. So, for example, going back to Boraju, where was he? He weighs 200 pounds. Now, if I inserted a therefore here, therefore he needs to lose weight, that doesn't follow. Cigarettes cause cancer and many other health problems. That's a purely descriptive claim. This doesn't follow from that, not by itself, right? Because you can't get a claim about what you should or shouldn't do from purely descriptive or factual claims. You can't get an ought from an is the philosophical shorthand for that claim. This is a principle that was written about by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So it's sometimes called Hume's principle in philosophical circles. You can't get an ought from an is. If you've got a claim, a conclusion about what you should or shouldn't do, you can't validly get that from claims just about the way the world actually is. Another term for it is you can't get a rabbit out of a hat, right? How does a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat? Well, because the rabbit was already there, right? You can't get something out of nothing. That's how the trick is done. So if you've got a conclusion about rabbits, one of your premises must say something about rabbits. Right? You can't get a conclusion about rabbits just from claims that don't say anything at all about rabbits. So here's that example again. Cigarette smoking has been shown to be a health hazard. That's a factual or descriptive claim. Therefore, governments should ban all advertising promoting cigarette smoking. Now look at the conclusion. There's something in it about governments and what they should do. But there's nothing about governments and what they should or shouldn't do in the premises, right? We've just got this factual claim. So for this argument to work, for this conclusion to follow, something else must be true. So what does this argument assume? What claim would we need to add to this argument in order to get the conclusion to follow? Anyone like to have a stab? Say again, sorry. Smoking is bad for you. I think that's more or less what the first premise is saying, right? That smoking is bad for you.
Advertising promotes cigarette smoking.
Advertising promotes cigarette smoking. Yes, I think that's right, because we do need something about that. Because, again, there's something here in this conclusion about advertising, but nothing in the premises about advertising. So yes, we do need that, but notice again, that's a purely factual claim. If by promotes you just mean it, increases the frequency of smoking in the population, and that's a causal claim, which we'll talk about tomorrow. That advertising promotes cigarette smoking. We still don't have anything yet about what government should or shouldn't do. Yeah. Government should have a responsibility to its citizens. Yes, exactly. Something like that we need. We can be a bit more specific, right? Because, what responsibilities? Well, here's a first attempt. Government should ban advertising that promotes activities. So I've folded in your point about, we need something about cigarette advertising promoting cigarette smoking. Government should ban advertising that promotes activities which are a health hazard. So that's itself a normative claim, right, about what government should or shouldn't do. So now, well, I've said here the conclusion now follows deductively, but I don't think it does, because we need your assumption as well that cigarette advertising does promote cigarette smoking. Because if that wasn't true, the argument wouldn't work. Right? If we added that in as well, now the conclusion follows. But now we've got a different question. One is fairly uncontroversially true. There aren't many people these days who deny that cigarette smoking is pretty bad for people. But is premise 2 true? Government should ban advertising that promotes activities which are a health hazard. Well, that's a normative claim. And it's a generalisation. Right? It says something to the effect that government should ban all advertising that promotes anything that's a health hazard. So it's a strong generalisation. Right? So to evaluate it, we can use the idea of counterexamples. So I didn't do this lecture, but it's up on Moodle, on the topic of generalisations and counterexamples. A counterexample to a generalisation like this, a universal generalisation, all A are B, would be an A which wasn't B. Counterexample to the generalisation, all swans are white, would be a swan which was pink or black. So can anyone think of a counterexample to this generalisation? It would be, what would a counterexample to this generalisation be? It would be an example of something that was a health hazard, but which the government shouldn't ban advertising of.
So it wouldn't be an example of someone who hasn't suffered any health hazards from it?
No, that would be a counterexample to a generalisation like this. Everyone who smokes becomes ill, right, or gets lung cancer. Then if you can point to someone and say, but this person's smoked a lot and they've never got any ill health, that's a counterexample to that universal generalisation.
The government should ban advertising that promotes McDonald's.
Right, okay, that's a nice example, right? That's pretty implausible, in case you didn't hear it. What about McDonald's, fast food, right? That's certainly not particularly good for you, right? Should the government therefore ban McDonald's advertising and Hungry Jack's advertising and so on and so forth? That's not quite so plausible. Good. Any other examples? Alcohol's a nice example, yeah. By the same argument, it would seem to follow that we ought to ban alcohol advertising. Now, here's a kind of response to someone giving a counterexample. The response is called biting the bullet, which is accepting the example, right? And so saying it's not a counterexample. So I would be biting the bullet if I said, yes, the government should ban McDonald's advertising. And yes, the government should ban alcohol advertising. Right? So I'm refusing to accept your counterexample. Now, biting the bullet in the McDonald's case seems a bit extreme. The alcohol case seems a bit more plausible to bite that bullet and say, well, yeah, actually, there should be some restrictions on alcohol advertising. But maybe we'll come back to that. You're getting the point, though. Just because it's a normative claim, it doesn't mean you have to just throw up your hands and go, oh my God, it's about what we should or shouldn't do, therefore I can't possibly reason about it. You've just done perfectly good reasoning about it, right? Some normative claims are generalisations, so you can think about counterexamples. The other kind of counterexample I thought of, things that are dangerous sports. I read somewhere once, and I'm just going to repeat it, but bearing in mind this may not be true. What do you think the most dangerous sport in Australia is? The one that kills most people by accident? According to the thing I read, it's fishing, sea fishing, because people get swept off the beach and drown. Right? So the government, it's a health hazard, right? Fishing. So government should ban all advertising relating to sea fishing. That's pretty implausible. Yeah. So now what you ought to be thinking, and perhaps some of you are thinking this, is, God, doesn't it depend a bit on what you mean by health hazard? And yes, it does. So one thing we might do is consider reformulating this principle to get something a bit more plausible, which is immune to the most implausible counterexamples, by making health hazard maybe a bit more specific. Because the sense in which cigarette smoking is a health hazard is of quite a different kind and scale as the way fast food is a health hazard or sea fishing is a health hazard. So how about something instead like this? Government should ban advertising of products that contribute to a serious public health problem. So I've changed health hazard to serious public health problems. And I've made a corresponding change to the factual premise, I hope. Yeah, cigarette smoking has been shown to be a serious public health problem, which is true. And now we've got a more plausible assumption. Still, you can still criticise even this assumption, premise 2. The alcohol counterexample still seems to work. Gambling is another example. Perhaps by the same argument, the government should ban alcohol advertising. There is another way to criticise that premise, which I alluded to before, when I said there's a difference between the way responsibilities of government are thought of here, typically, and in Europe, compared to the US. So would anyone like to pretend to be an American libertarian and attack premise 2 on that kind of grounds?
The government should keep their nose.
Yeah, government should fuck off. What's it got to do with you? It's like, that's what you'd say about the sea fishing one. Well, if I choose to put my life in danger, as long as I know the risk is up to me. Government shouldn't be such a nanny and interfere all the time. Same with cigarette smoking. I don't know whether this is true, but I've said that twice now. It's a bit annoying, isn't it? I'm kind of just making things up. But I could imagine that the big American tobacco companies, when they were arguing with the US government about whether cigarette smoking really causes lung cancer, and if so, what the government should be done about it, and having warning labels on packets of cigarettes, they might have started pushing that line, right? This is a thin end of a wedge. If the state starts interfering in this, in people's private habits, then what next? There's a name for that kind of form of argument. It's a common form of argument that you see when someone wants to argue that we shouldn't do something. It's the thin end of a wedge. If you start doing that, then it will lead to worse and worse things. Right?
Slippery slope.
It's called slippery slope, thank you. Or as another student of mine once called it, the slippery rope argument. It's just as good, right? In fact, a bit nicer. Slippery slope or slippery rope. You may have seen such arguments in the recent debates about same-sex marriage. If we introduce that, then it will lead to other worse things. And if you think about it, sometimes people talk about the slippery slope fallacy as though any argument like that was wrong. But some slippery slope arguments are really quite good arguments, right? If it really was true that doing something would lead to some really terrible consequences and had no good consequences, then indeed we shouldn't do it. What tends to go wrong with those kind of arguments is that the key premise that, if we introduce same-sex marriage, or if we introduce euthanasia, then all these terrible things will happen. The premise is not well supported by any arguments. That's what normally goes wrong with those kind of arguments. The premise that if we do that, it will lead to all these bad things is exaggerated and not well supported. You've got no good reason really to think it's true. So there's a bit of a summary for evaluating normative arguments. Again, same two questions. Are the premises true? Well, some of the premises will be factual premises, so you can decide whether you should accept them. Are they supported by good evidence or by some relevant expert source or authority? Any argument for a normative claim will at least implicitly rely on some normative premises too. If they're not there explicitly in the argument, they're there implicitly, so you can evaluate those. Typically there'll be some kind of generalisation, so you can evaluate them using the method of counterexamples, trying to think of counterexamples, or asking the question, well, suppose we accepted that principle, what further consequences would there be? It's another way to think about it. If some of those consequences would be pretty bad, then you've got a reason not to accept the principle. Are the premises sufficient to establish the conclusion? Then this is the question of support, completely independent of the question whether the premises are true. This is probably the most important question to ask. Have all the relevant considerations for and against been considered? That leads me to this next topic of one-sidedness of arguments. This is probably the most important thing I want to say today, because this is the most common way in which arguments for normative claims go wrong. They're one-sided. A strong argument for a normative claim, one which really did support the conclusion, would consider all the pros and cons, both, of the proposed course of action, and then try to weigh them up and come to a conclusion about what you should or shouldn't do. Right? But that's hard work, right? So people who want to convince you of a normative claim tend not to bother. They tend to offer only one part of that argument, one side of it. So if they want to argue that you should do something, they'll just consider all the pros. If they want to say you shouldn't do something, they'll just consider the cons, mention some cons for you. So you might have an argument like that. If we do X, then there will be certain bad consequences, A, B and C. So here's some of the cons of X. Therefore we shouldn't do X. That doesn't follow. Even if the premise is true, it's not sufficient to support the conclusion. Why not? Not by itself. Why not? Because there could be good consequences of X as well, and those good consequences might outweigh the bad consequences. Equally, the second argument here is the conclusion doesn't follow. If we do X, then there will be good consequences, A, B and C. Therefore we should do that. Right? Well, again, no, that doesn't follow by itself. Even if it was true, that premise by itself wouldn't be enough to support the conclusion, because again, well, this time there might be some bad consequences of X. And those bad consequences might outweigh the good consequences. Right? If the government, so here's an example of that. If the government printed money, printed loads and loads of extra money and just gave $20,000 to everyone, then everyone would be really happy and be able to buy lots of things and everything would be great, right? So that's what we should do. The government should print money and just give it away. Well, presumably there's some economic downsides to that too, right? Inflation is supposed to be one. Everything would get more and more and more expensive. So just because something has some good consequences, that's not enough to justify doing it, because it might also have some bad consequences. Equally, just because something has some bad consequences doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Not by itself, because there might also be good consequences. And the good consequences might outweigh the bad. I mean, there are extreme... Why have I said usually? Because there are kind of extreme cases where it's just obvious that it probably is enough. If we let Donald Trump access nuclear weapons with his Twitter account, right, and he could blow up the whole world at 3 a.m. in the morning, right, when he wakes up and goes, oh shit, I've accidentally launched nuclear missiles and everything, right, killing everybody. So we probably shouldn't let him do that. Right? But really what's going on there is it's just pretty clear that the bad consequences outweigh any possible good consequences, right? Here's a real example. Introducing a minimum wage will increase unemployment, an argument against the minimum wage. Does it follow that we shouldn't introduce the minimum wage? Well, even if that's true, argument about this might focus on whether that premise is true, right? That it will increase unemployment, the minimum wage, because it makes it more expensive for employers to hire people, is the idea. Okay, suppose that's true. Does it mean we shouldn't have a minimum wage? Not necessarily, because there might be all sorts of good consequences of having a minimum wage, which might outweigh these bad consequences. Yes, unemployment will go up a bit, but you might be able to finish that sentence. Carbon tax is the most efficient and effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so therefore all governments should introduce carbon tax. Right? Well, again, even if true, and it's, people argue about whether the premise is true, the point I want to get across is that this kind of argument suffers from the same problem as of one-sidedness. It just mentions the good, and it is indeed good, right? But what about the bad? There might be some bad too. And now we've got to ask the question, does the good outweigh the bad? What's the balance? But you can see how, to get a really good argument for a claim like this, you're going to need lots and lots of premises, right? It takes a lot. And it's difficult and requires judgment, and sometimes it's just not clear at all whether the good outweighs the bad. Which is why people tend to get lazy. Point and not bother. Just mention the good things and the bad things, or the bad things. But you really need both. All right, I just want to say a little bit about how this problem of one-sidedness applies when you have public debates. By public debate, I mean, well, something like the debate we had running up to the poll on same-sex marriage in Australia, or the debate about whether the UK should leave the European Union, happened in the UK a few years ago, or Scottish independence, or all these things. Independence for the Kurds. Right. People talk about a public debate, which is people are supposed to, in public, debate the issue with each other, right? Now, there are serious problems, in my view, with the way our society and other societies run public debates, because here's what usually happens, right? It becomes adversarial, and, kind of rightly, you have one group of people arguing for and another group of people arguing against, right? Now, you're a member of the public who's maybe a bit undecided about whether the UK should leave the European Union, for example, and then suddenly you're bombarded in this big public campaign with arguments for and arguments against. Now, what should happen is that everyone agrees on is that we can weigh up the pros and cons, right? We have the good things and we have the bad things, and you have to try and weigh it up. But that's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult for ordinary person to make a reasonable decision, a rational decision in that case. Why? Well, because both sides will tend to exaggerate their case, right? So the for side will be one-sided. And they will just talk about all the good things that the European Union brings, for example, and not mention any of the bad things. And perhaps they, even if people don't deliberately lie, although that can happen too, they might exaggerate the good things. And the other side will do the same, right? They will mention all the bad things and perhaps exaggerate or lie a little bit and not mention any of the good things. So you've got two people giving you exaggerated one-sided arguments. If it's a complex issue, there'll be complex factual matters to consider as well, as were in the case of the Brexit debate. Complicated economic things, right, which nobody understands. It's very hard for people to understand, including experts. So both sides, you've got to then rely on experts, right? You've got to believe what the experts are telling you about what the economic consequences will be. But it's not always a simple matter to evaluate how reliable an expert is. Should you believe them? Well, again, it's work. Hard work to think, okay, should I accept this so-called expert? And of course, both sides will have their pet experts, right? So one side will have some experts saying, Brexit will be a disaster for the economy. The other side will be able to wheel out some experts as well who will say, Brexit won't be a disaster, it will be great for the economy, right? Now, if you're an ordinary person like me who doesn't know anything about economics, who the hell do you believe? Right? There's a tendency, and this was clear in the Brexit case, to not believe any of them, to just reject all experts. This kind of situation where you have two sides to a public debate offering their arguments for and against is ripe for confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a sort of biased search for evidence. So if you already believe something, or have some tendency to believe it, you'll notice and perhaps actively seek out facts that support what you believe, and you'll ignore, and certainly not actively seek out, evidence that counts against your belief. So here's a little example. My partner thinks that white vans, like tradies vans, that people who drive white vans are dangerous drivers, right? That's her generalisation, right? And now, of course, every time we see a white van swerving in front of us, or suddenly braking or doing something dangerous, she can say, "Look, there you go, see, white van, dangerous." It being my job to boringly point out, "Look, white van, perfectly safe, not doing anything. Oh, look, there's another white van, not doing anything." Right? But notice, if you're the person who believes that, you just don't notice the white vans that are driving perfectly safely, right? But every time you see one doing something dangerous, you're going to go, more evidence for my theory. That's confirmation bias. It's exactly the problem. You get exactly the same problem with public debates, right? Because suppose you're already a little bit disposed to be for the policy, for example, then you've got all these people giving you evidence and reasons, and experts giving you bits of evidence that will help you support your case, right? And it's quite easy to ignore all the other people. So, what's the solution? Well, I don't know. I don't think we should not have public debates about things, but what we really need is some kind of independent organisations that can try to collate all this information, filter out the bits that are exaggerated or just false, and then at least try and present it in a form that makes it easier for people to weigh up the pros and cons. Now, there are some, dedicated people who set up websites to do that kind of thing, fact-checking websites and so on. But they are fairly limited and tend to be kind of run by volunteers. But something like that is surely what we need. Okay, so that's my rant about debates. think I'll skip over this a bit about consequences and rights. And you can look at the slides if you like. Basically, the point there is, I've been saying that to get a strong argument for a normative claim, you need to weigh up the pros and cons. And I was thinking in terms of consequences. What will be the good consequences? What will be the bad consequences? Does the good outweigh the bad, or does the bad outweigh the good? Many people think that consequences aren't the only thing that matter, though. Even if something would have very, very good consequences and no bad consequences, sometimes people think that it would still be wrong to do it because it might violate rights. So rights are another kind of consideration that can get involved in arguments for normative claims. They're considerations of a different kind to the consideration of positive and negative consequences, but equally important. Let me talk a bit about some common fallacies in normative arguments. I've been talking mostly today about what I consider the most important one, which is just one-sidedness. But there are some others, and I've mentioned these before. One kind of argument that you typically get against a policy is an ad hominem argument. An ad hominem means at the man, or at the person. So this is the fallacy of, instead of criticising the argument that someone's given, you make some irrelevant point about the person, or perhaps the organisation, giving the argument. It's very easy to do with politicians, because politicians have always got some motive for saying the things they do. So you can always say, yeah, but you would say that, you're just trying to get elected. Or, yeah, but you've got some vested interest in the conclusion being that way. These things are not relevant. Right? If a person's given an argument, then facts about the person giving the argument aren't relevant to whether it's a good argument or not. The question is just, are their premises true? Does the conclusion follow? And I briefly mentioned this at the beginning when I said that the distinction between descriptive and normative claims wasn't always clear-cut. Here's a way people who want to convince you of things sometimes blur that distinction in order to kind of sneak a normative claim past you. And it just has to do with, there are many words that we have in English and all other languages that are kind of both descriptive and normative at the same time. Like the word illegal, right? If you say that something's illegal, on the one hand, that's just a description of what the law is in the country where you happen to live. Right? It's a purely factual claim. But because we tend to think that for most of the laws we have anyway, breaking them would be wrong, something you shouldn't do. Calling something illegal also has some moral overtones, some normative overtones. That's therefore something you shouldn't do, right? So people often use loaded terms instead of giving an argument. So what they want to do is say, we shouldn't do something, but instead of giving an argument, they just describe it in a certain way using one of these loaded terms, like illegal. So this use of this term, illegal arrival, for people arriving in Australia or any other country by boat in order to seek asylum, is clearly loaded. I mean, it's not even factually correct, because there's nothing illegal about people arriving by boat still in Australia. There's nothing illegal about arriving in any way at all in any country to seek refugee status. Queue jumpers are clearly loaded. Right? These terms often come in pairs, right? Loaded either way, either positively or negatively. So terrorist versus freedom fighter. It's impossible to describe someone, to merely describe someone as a terrorist and make that just be a kind of merely factual claim, right? It's going to have normative connotations. It's a bad thing, right? Being a terrorist is a bad thing. Freedom fighter, right? Sounds pretty good though. Asylum seeker, that's the kind of perhaps neutral term. Illegal arrival, queue jumper. Dole bludger, pretty obviously loaded, versus person in receipt of welfare payments, fairly neutral. I'll just mention this one. So global warming used to be the most common term that scientists use. The term climate change was a term coined by what we now call climate change deniers. Because global warming sounds bad, right? Things are warming up. Notice how climate change is all kind of neutral. The climate's just changing. Chill out, man. Don't worry about it. So it's actually, climate change is actually a euphemism introduced by what we now call climate change deniers, but it's kind of now become the dominant term. I do want to mention this one, reform versus change, right? Now, calling something a reform automatically makes it sound like a positive thing. Can you have a bad reform? To many people, that sounds contradictory, to call something a bad reform. If it's bad, it's not a reform. But, well, the word reform really just means a change. It's a reforming, something new. That's all it means. So certainly you could have a bad reform. But, well, the meaning has changed or become now quite loaded. So all you need to do is say, the arts faculty at Monash University are going to reform the way lectures are done for first years. Well, good, that sounds nice. I'm going to reform it. That sounds like positive things. What they're actually going to do is change them, not necessarily for the good.